welcome class. Thank you for joining us once again. Very special treat today. For the first time publicly, he's giving this presentation. I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Ryan Attar, and he's going to give you a bit about himself, a bit of his story, and he's going to tell us all about the cycle of Mr. Randall, Dr. Randall, Professor Randall, his cycle, that thing. I've seen this presentation once already. It's great. I enjoyed it very much. There may be some discussion at various points to try and clarify a bit of it. But other than that, over to you, Captain.
Hey, thanks so much, Bart. It's really awesome that you're having me on here to do this. This presentation is inspired by videos that I've seen of yours, and I've been following you for quite some time. And really love all of your content and what you do. I was initially drawn to your channel from the the popular YouTube videos where you critique these people who are wrong on the internet and do a great job at that. And then later on, when I discovered your other videos where kind of more like lecture style, university lecture style videos where you have a completely different persona, but these videos are equally as awesome. And I think, a lot of people would be interested to watch those and can learn a lot from them too. So, along this line, this is my presentation on something that you've talked about quite a bit, the Randall cycle and how it applies to diabetes. So I'm a naturopathic physician. I am also type 1 diabetic. And so diabetes is something that I know very well, and I see a lot of patients with diabetes. And I'm a big believer in the approach to nutrition that you take, and especially when it comes to insulin resistance and diabetes. So dive right into it. A little background about me: I wasn't always a naturopathic physician. I was in the Army and spent 6 years in. I was an Army captain, and then came down with type 1 diabetes at age 26. And this was back in 2006. I'm 42 now, and classic symptoms of diabetes: polyuria, polydipsia, meaning I was drinking tons of water and peeing like every hour. And why that's happening is because blood sugars are so high and the body can't use that sugar. The kidneys just say, okay, that's it, and release it through your urine. And you just pee out glucose. I was down about 30 pounds. And that picture you see me there on the bottom, it's hard to tell because the uniforms are very baggy by nature, but I'm super skinny there. That's just before I was diagnosed. So I'm like falling out of my uniform right there. So I got diagnosed, and I had about a year in after that in the military, and you're not fit for duty. So you get medically retired. And it's understandable, you can't deploy if you have to give yourself insulin or potentially could have a low blood sugar and put yourself or put your fellow soldiers in danger. So I was medically retired. So I got out, and I'm a pretty disciplined person and followed what my doctors were telling me, and which is basically keep eating the diet that you're eating and count up your carbs and take insulin. And, I had okay control of my blood sugars with that. Not very good or not very normal blood sugars when it comes to what non-diabetic people have. But meanwhile, I was just picking up any book I could find on health, nutrition, diabetes, and just getting myself smarter. And eventually I started getting really, really good control of my blood sugars because I found a low carb diet. So this is back in 2010, and I've been doing that for over a decade. And I have here some of my A1Cs over the years, and I included a little chart there showing the U.S. and the British and New Zealand as well units for both A1C and average glucose to kind of put things in perspective here. But my A1Cs are generally 4.5 to 4.8, which is exceptional control for a diabetic. You rarely see folks with A1Cs this good. And unfortunately, these days you don't see non-diabetics with A1Cs like this because most people are not healthy. So really good control over the years. And I started to get really frustrated with my doctors because I wasn't following the diet that they were recommending. And they were even trying to discourage me from doing a low carb diet, and would even tell me things like, my A1C is too low. It must mean that I have low blood sugars all the time. And, you should get that A1C up, which is absolutely crazy. And I wasn't having lows pretty much ever because, on a low carb diet requires very low doses of insulin. So when a type 1 diabetic like myself has a low blood sugar, it's basically an insulin overdose. And if you're following a high carb diet, you need a lot of insulin to balance out the carbohydrates. And unless you get that insulin exact, you're gonna be either high or low one way or the other. So on a low carb diet, it's very easy to estimate your insulin doses because the doses are so low. So yeah, I got frustrated with these doctors and figured I could do it better myself, and went back to school initially for my master's degree in nutrition, and then I did a doctorate in naturopathic medicine. I was very lucky too when I was a student to get to spend a couple days with Dr. Bernstein, who is the number one guy in the low carb diabetes world. And he's a legend. And I wrote a little article about it. And if you Google 3 days with Dr. Bernstein, you'll find it's on Diabetes Daily. The guy was just amazing. He's 88 years old now, still in practice, still super healthy, been doing the low carb method since the 1970s. He invented that way of managing diabetes, basically. He invented self blood sugar monitoring too. At the time, you couldn't check your blood sugar yourself. There was no devices available, so you had to go to your doctor to do it. He got one and started experimenting on himself. He was an engineer. He wasn't a doctor at this time, and started trying different food and realized he could manage his blood sugar if he had a low carb diet. Went to publish a paper on this, on both home blood sugar monitoring and a low carb diet, but nobody would publish an engineer. So in his 40s, he went to medical school and became a doctor, and still in practice today. So now the myth of the balanced diet, the Randle cycle, and how it applies to insulin resistance and diabetes. But first, I want to talk about what exactly a balanced diet means. And what you see here, this is the macronutrients that the average American is eating over the years. So we have the 1970s until the 2000s here. Starting at the bottom here, and this is absolutely terrible, is how low amount of protein that Americans are eating. And, kind of like the textbook definition of a low carb or a low fat diet, even though, most people in practice would do less, but the textbook definition is usually under 20%. This protein is well under 20% that Americans are eating, somewhere around 15%. And so bad. But we're going to forget about protein for a second, because with the balance, we're talking about kind of the energy macronutrients, carbohydrate and fat. So pretty much across the board, Americans have been eating a high carbohydrate diet, steadily increasing over the years. With fat, it's kind of decreased with the lipid hypothesis and this phobia of fat over the years. Decreased, but still, this is still a significant amount of fat, moderate to high. So both carbohydrates in the American diet and fat are, moderate to high. And, we're looking at about 35% and up for those two things. The American dietary recommendations over the years mirror these macronutrient recommendations, starting with the four food groups in the 1950s. So you had dairy, meat, veg, fruit, and cereal was the four food groups. In 1992, we got the food pyramid. This was the genius food guidelines that told us to have 6 to 11 servings of grain a day. So basically unlimited breadsticks at Olive Garden and you're good. The latest one, and this is 2012, I believe, is My Plate. And macronutrient wise, and in the major kind of groups of food, it's not much different than the food pyramid. And the macronutrients, the carbohydrates and fat, really match those averages that we saw that Americans are eating, right? I thought this was really interesting. So this is a graph showing the rates of diabetes in the USA over the years from 1958 to looks like 2015. And I looked at the dates where those food guidelines were introduced, and it's there's like a steep increase every time they have this genius idea to make these food recommendations. Obviously can't say that these food recommendations are causing the increase in diabetes, but they certainly aren't doing anything to decrease the rate of diabetes in this country. And obesity follows the same pattern too. This is something that was like floating around on Twitter recently. This is NHANES data just before the pandemic. So these are average Americans over the age of 20, and it's absolutely terrible. So A1C I look at first because I'm the diabetes guy. Average Americans A1C over the age of 20 is 5.8. Now, if you look at the little guide here with the American and British units, pre-diabetes is a 5.7 and up A1C. So the average American is above pre-diabetic levels when it comes to A1C. So there's that. Fasting glucose is actually pretty elevated. Fasting insulin as well. All these markers, weight, triglycerides, not looking really good. So the balanced diet that Americans are eating is not doing good things to them. Specifically for diabetics, the big organizations like the American Diabetes Association, really no different when it comes to dietary recommendations. You can see this like tweet from them telling a diabetic to have 45 to 60 grams of carbs at each meal and 15 to 28 grams of carbs for a snack. For a non-diabetic, that's a crazy amount of carbohydrate. But for a diabetic, that's causing unimaginable harm to them. What you see right here is average A1Cs amongst diabetics by age. This early spike is, around when a lot of people are diagnosed. So, A1Cs can get pretty high then, but there's no excuse. It's possible to bring down that A1C very quickly. But a lot of times, the teen years, the early 20s, diabetics just don't have good control and don't really, take care of their diet. But as you can see across the adults here, A1C is averaging around 7.5 to 8 and very, very high. So diabetics are not getting good control of themselves on average. And, again, just like the American dietary recommendations aren't helping, neither is the American Diabetes Association's recommendations helping. So Randle cycle. And if you watch Bart YouTubes, you know a lot about this and how important it is for insulin sensitivity. And so a mixed macronutrient diet and caloric excess causes elevated blood glucose, elevated insulin resistance, elevated triglycerides, and leads to prediabetes, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and all the chronic ailments that go along with that as well. Founded by Randall, John Randall. He was a diabetes and metabolism researcher. I wish more diabetes and metabolism researchers would look at this stuff because it's very important. It doesn't seem like anyone really addresses it anymore. I don't even really see, if you look around on YouTube, I don't really see other scientists talking about it. Or, even if someone didn't agree with, this idea that we should choose one side of the Randle cycle or the other, I haven't even seen anyone try to debunk that or offer any other theories on it. But it should be talked about more, and it's not. So the Randle cycle states that the inhibition of glucose is caused by fatty acid metabolism, and fatty acid metabolism is inhibited by glucose metabolism. And we'll see it right here, starting with the fat metabolism. So this is a low carb diet. And the blue out here is what's floating around in the blood. Fatty acids come into the cytosol, and then into the mitochondria, where it undergoes beta oxidation. That in turn goes to citrate. But right here, you have the first inhibition when you're metabolizing fat, and that's pyruvate dehydrogenase right here. So from the glycolysis, from glucose metabolism, right? So citrate then continues on into the cytosol, where two more inhibitions happen. One is this rate limiting step in glycolysis, PFK1, and the GLUT4 transporter, the transporter that allows glucose to come into the cell. And you can imagine if you're inhibiting glucose from entering the cell, that means blood glucose is going to go up in your blood, which is not a good thing. That's basically the cause of all diabetic complications are the elevated blood sugar. And when blood sugar goes up, the sorbitol goes up in your cells, and sorbitol does some nasty things. It has an osmotic pull and pulls water into your cell and causes the cell to burst. This can damage every cell and organ in our body, but there's certain cells in our body that have very, very low amounts of sorbitol dehydrogenase, and those are the retinas, the kidneys, your peripheral nerves. And guess what are the most common complication in diabetes? Retinopathy, nephropathy, neuropathy. Yeah, so blood glucose going up, not good. And so if we're metabolizing fat and we try to metabolize glucose, it's blocked like that. Other side. So say we're doing a high carb, low fat diet. So glucose comes in, goes through glycolysis, into pyruvate. Pyruvate goes into the mitochondria, which then goes into citrate, into the Krebs cycle again. And then here, malonyl-CoA inhibits CPT1, the transporter that brings fatty acids into the mitochondria. And what happens here? Triglycerides build up. And, elevated triglycerides are not good as well. So again, we're metabolizing glucose. If we try to metabolize fat, we get elevations in triglycerides. If we metabolizing fat and we try to metabolize glucose, it gets blocked, we raise blood sugar. Someone following the standard American diet is doing both of these at the same time all the time, getting elevated blood sugar, elevated triglycerides. Not good. Outcomes of the Randle cycle. Also things that Bart K talks about a lot here. Increase in organic phosphate in the mitochondria and cytosol. Pro-inflammatory cytokines are activated. This causes chronic inflammation. The elevated blood glucose and elevated insulin itself is an issue. The elevated triglycerides are an issue. And all these chronic ailments that we have, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, dementia, a lot of other things, all due to this. So something Bart and I were talking about when we chatted before about understanding human nutrition. And nutrition studies are notoriously terrible, right? They're big epidemiological studies that look at the standard American diet and then blame poor health on the little bit of protein and meat that people are eating. And it's just not a good way an accurate way to look at human nutrition. What I think is a good way is looking at two things, and they're really on opposite sides of kind of the scientific world. One is biochemistry, like we just talked about, and the other is anthropology. And if you watch Bart's channel, he talks about this a lot, that there's no question of what our human ancestors, for as far back as we can measure, were eating. And we look at the nitrogen isotope testing, and we can see exactly what they're eating. And it's very accurate and so specific that we know exactly what type of animals that they were eating. And we were eating mostly animal meat and fat. And it's pretty clear. And our bodies are kind of geared towards eating those foods and having those foods readily available all the time. And we do a great job when we have a low carb, high fat diet. And so now we can't still metabolize glucose. But the human being, our ancestral human being in the wild was not exposed to a whole lot of high starch and high glucose foods. There wasn't farming, so there wasn't this food that we've kind of cultivated to be starchy or sweet. There was maybe some very tart, very fibrous berries and tubers if they were edible even. And these would have only been eaten during times of starvation. And so the body's then, if it is times of starvation and we do get this little bit of carbohydrate, the body's going to turn off that fat metabolism, metabolize this glucose, store it as fat. And, this is how we're wired. And again, we know that. We know exactly how we ate as our Paleolithic ancestors did. So, question for anyone watching, I'll give you a few seconds to ponder it, is name one single food, non-processed, non-prepared, so one whole food that has both moderate to high carbs and fat. Think about it. There is only one, and that one food is actually significant. It's milk. And it's the only food that we have that's both moderate to high, both carbs and fat. And only one thing really consumes is babies and small children. And small babies and kids are energy machines, and they're growing machines, and they're able to use both those macronutrients to grow. And additionally, nursing babies have elevated ketones naturally. So they're burning all three major energy sources and just growing and growing and growing. Once a baby's weaned and they're not having this very rapid growth, they no longer can metabolize both fats and carbs together. And again, that food, the single whole food that has both high fat and high carb just doesn't exist unless we put it together. And a human in the wild, our ancestral humans, are just not ever going to see that. So, when it comes to diabetes and insulin resistance, what do you do to normalize your insulin sensitivity? How do you manage this correctly? You got to choose a diet, either a low carb or a low fat diet. Now, I kind of mentioned before that, less than 20% is the kind of textbook definition of a low carb and low fat diet. But in practice, the people that are doing either a low carb or low fat diet correctly are doing much less than that. For low carb, it's probably best around 5%. Definitely, we should not be doing this mixed macronutrient diet. Very important when you do choose a diet. What are the goals? And for me, for my patients that are diabetic, my goals are non-diabetic numbers. A1Cs, non-diabetic, fasting glucose, postprandial glucose. I want this all non-diabetic. And I think that should be everyone's goal too. So if you do choose a diet and you get these things tested, check out what a normal non-diabetic person should be. And wrong phrasing there, not a normal person, because we saw what the average person looks like, but what a person in optimal health looks like. And that's an A1C around 5.0 and less. That should be your goal. If you're not achieving that, consider another diet. When it comes to A1C, a couple things here. So my goal is usually under 5 A1C. When you get under 5, what happens is you get these nice, what I have here is continuous glucose monitor screenshots. So these are wearable devices that show your glucose 24/7. The green bars in the middle are kind of normal blood sugars. So what you see in this 4.8 and 4.5 area is normal non-diabetic blood sugar, kind of flatlined across, which is perfect, optimal, super healthy. That's the way it should be. So on the flip side, and I showed you that graph with the typical diabetics A1Cs, 7 to 8 range. You see these green bars here where the normal blood sugars are. These are super high erratic blood sugars almost across all day long, sometimes dipping down into the normal level, but, as soon as they eat, bouncing right back up. And again, all the complications of diabetes are occurring when blood sugars are up here. Now, this middle column is kind of what most endocrinologists would say are well-controlled diabetics, and probably give them a pat on the back for being in this range, kind of like 5.9 to 6.5 range. But still, these diabetics are spiking into hyperglycemia, just not seen by non-diabetics. And the time that they're having these high blood sugars is not benign. It is doing damage to every cell and organ in their body. So then you even get into, under 6, and, 5.5 is a non-diabetic A1C technically. But, if you're diabetic and you're here, or even a non-diabetic, you're probably seeing elevations into hyperglycemia that are doing damage to your body. So that's why I aim for here. That's why my blood sugars look like this. So I follow the low carb diet. I follow Dr. Bernstein's method for managing diabetes. I could not recommend this method enough, and his book enough. This book is not a diet guide. The diet is hugely important to this method, but there is a lot more to managing diabetes than just the diet alone. And this book really covers it well. And both for type 1 and type 2 diabetics. I in my patients that are type 1 and 2 diabetics, I get the same results, and these normal non-diabetic levels that I showed you. And that's my goal. That's my goal for my patients. And that's what I get through this method. I also feel this is, and I know Bart K does, and I know a lot of his followers feel this way too, that this is nutritionally ideal. It's a animal protein focused diet, and our bodies like this, our bodies respond well, and our bodies stay healthy doing this. This method is also backed by some good research too. And there was a Harvard study in 2018 in the journal Pediatrics, and there was a lot of children in this study. And you'll get a lot of pushback from recommending a low carb diet to children. You'll hear things like, no, kids need carbohydrates to grow, which is completely not true. The children in this study had exceptional blood sugar control. I think the average was their blood sugars were averaged right about 100, which in type 1 diabetes, for a study on type 1 diabetes is really exceptional to see that. Low rates of adverse events. So they were having low rates of hypo. So this danger of a low carb diet putting you at risk for hypoglycemia was not found here. My favorite thing about this study was that the kids in it were, let me back that up. First of all, type 1 diabetic kids are on average shorter than their peers. Their growth is stunted because of their diabetes. The kids in this study not only were not stunted, but were taller than their peers. And no surprise to me, because kids eating a high protein diet and sufficient calories through fat they're giving their body what it needs. And our bodies grow with protein. And the average American kid is not getting enough protein. And that's why these kids were taller than their peers. So it's pretty amazing to see that. One very important thing about a low carb diet when it comes to type 1 diabetes, what I have specifically, is injected insulin is never going to be like injected or an insulin pump. I have an insulin pump myself, and I've done the same kind of results that I have with my pump with injections as well. Injected or pumped insulin is never going to be like a human pancreas. A human pancreas is connected to our vessels. It's sensing our blood sugar. It's putting insulin directly into our bloodstream to tightly manage it. When you inject insulin, it takes a while for that to be absorbed. And what I have here is the action of insulin. And, this first bar you see here is the rapid insulin that a diabetic would take with a meal. And, for the first 30, 45 minutes up to an hour, it's not even at its full potency. So a pancreas can get that insulin into the bloodstream right away, but injections can never mimic that. For a type 1 diabetic, managing your blood sugars means counting, the carbs or protein in your diet, taking the appropriate amount of insulin. If I'm eating a high carb diet and I'm matching my insulin with the carbohydrates in that diet, it is so hard to match this rapid spike to the rapid spike of carbohydrate. And they're two very high numbers, and matching them up is a near impossibility. Now, a low carb diet, we get a very, very mild spike from protein. And there's a misconception that the protein is turning into glucose. It's not. It's the digestive process that's occurring in everyone, and glucagon being released. And you see a mild spike like 2-3 hours after a meal from this. So I don't even use this rapid insulin because it's designed for the standard American high carb diet. I use this older insulin called regular insulin. It's a milder insulin, and it has a little bit of longer effect, and it matches the protein. I use a small dose of this, and it matches the protein perfectly. And that's a big part of how I can successfully manage diabetes, and part of the Bernstein method of managing type 1 diabetes. So say that a low carb diet is not for you. Say you're a vegan and you haven't watched Bart K's YouTube channel enough. If you want to normalize blood sugars, your best bet is going on a low fat diet, not a mixed macronutrient diet. Keep fats low. If you're a type 2 diabetic, you will actually see decent blood sugars and normal blood sugars. And I admit I've seen this in type 2 diabetics. If you're a type 1 diabetic, you will see improvements because you will become more insulin sensitive, and the ratios of carbs to insulin you're using will be decreased a bit. But it's nowhere near the small amounts and that I use, and not this mild insulin too that makes it also easier to control. If this is your only option and you're not going to do a low carb diet, do not do a mixed macro diet. Keep fats low, and that's your best bet for normalizing blood sugar. I don't think it's adequate nutritionally. I know Bart K doesn't think it's adequate nutritionally, but that's your best bet for normal blood sugars. I have one more thing here. That's basically the end of my presentation. There's a documentary coming out on November 9th, and I'm interviewed in it. It's called The Diabetes Solution, and it's all about low-carb folks who are having great control of their diabetes, doing exactly what I'm doing. So it's going to be on a bunch of different platforms, Vimeo, Apple, and Amazon, and you can pre-order it and rent it too when it comes out on the 9th. So please check it out. I'm in it. Dr. Bernstein is in it. Dr. Ken Berry's in it. So check it out, and it's going to be great. And that's it. That's my contact information if anyone wants to get in touch with me.
Awesome. Look, I did warn you, boys and girls, about how good that presentation was. Ryan, you haven't disappointed, as I knew you wouldn't. It was brilliant.
Thank you, Bart.
There was a couple of things in there that I think is worth discussing just a little bit further, teasing out just a little bit more, just to reinforce the learning, just to help people to really get a good grasp on this material. If you wouldn't mind, Ryan, can you just bring us back to the slides where you showed those two slides about the Randall cycle, this case and that case slides?
Yeah.
Slide 13 and 14. So here we have slide 13. So this, as Ryan quite rightly said, was the situation where you have someone consuming a low carbohydrate diet, which means, obviously they will be consuming a great deal more free fatty acids in their diet. And as such, those fatty acids will pour through the cell, pour through the mitochondria, provide the energy that is required by that cell in that way. And in so doing, lock out the cell to the absorption and usage of glucose. So the more predominant fat is, the more glucose is blocked out. This is not an on-off switch, right? This is a variable activity here. So you have more and more and more fat pouring into the cell, less and less sugar can get in, less and less sugar can be metabolized. This is the thing that is spoken about often by the vegans when they point to these scans on type 2 diabetics, looking at for example, their skeletal muscle cells as the usual example they use. And they say, look, there are fat droplets in this cell. That's what's causing the insulin resistance. Therefore, fat is the bad guy. Incredible reductionism to say that. I think it's vital to understand that fat within the cytosol of a cell is not toxic. Fat within the bloodstream is not toxic. Glucose in the bloodstream is toxic. Glucose in the cell is even more toxic. At the end of the day, your body is designed in such a way that if there is too much sugar in your system, number one, we're going to lock that sugar out of the cells, because sugar inside a cell will glycate the proteins in that cell. It will destroy the cell organelles progressively. It can interfere with DNA, RNA, bad stuff. You don't want too much glucose in your cell. So let's lock it out to the blood. And how does that work? Well, it's right there at the top of the page where the GLUT4 transporter is locked when there is a lot of fat pouring through. So what we've got there is a situation where, right, glucose now has to pool in the blood rather than getting into the cells. The cells are protected. The sacrificial lamb, for want of a better term, are the red blood cells, the white blood cells, the epithelial cells in the vascular tree. All of those things are repairable, replaceable on a much shorter schedule than replacing a skeletal muscle cell, for example, or a cardiac cell, a heart cell, or any of these kind of cells. The design via nature was that pouring a lot of sugar into our system happened rarely. It happened when we were able to find a whole bunch of berries, which were available to us perhaps 2-3 weeks a year. At what time of year, by the way? Right at the end of the fall, just before the winter, right when you need to be fattened up to get through a cold winter. Hello, nature's an amazing thing, isn't it? So that's the first comment I wanted to make on that one, how that one works. The next slide, in the other situation where you have predominant glucose as your metabolism, what you can see here is that sugar pouring through a cell and predominating tends to lock out the fat. Again, this is not an on-off switch. This is a progressive continuum. The more sugar that pours through, the more fat gets locked out of entering the cell. This is a way of ensuring that the sugar that is in the cell gets used before it can glycate and destroy that cell. Unless there are fat droplets in the cell because you've been eating a species-appropriate, species-specific diet and filling that cell with an adequate amount of stored fatty molecules for later use, in which case that sugar is much more immediately toxic. The other thing that I wanted to say was that this is not an either-or situation. Neither is it an on-off switch in either situation. This is not either-or either. Okay? If you eat all glucose diet with no fat in it, as Ryan said, you're going to be deficient. You're not going to be healthy anyway, but the Randle cycle is going to be alleviated and you're not going to have this particular issue. If you eat all fat, no carbohydrates, same deal. As soon as you mix these two slides that we're showing you here, compare and contrast, these actually take these slides in your mind and superimpose them upon each other. They are happening at the same time, and the relative continuum level of deactivation of the other macronutrient depends on the relative intakes. So if you have the standard diet, 65% carbohydrates, as Ryan showed earlier, a significant amount of fat still, you've got Randle cycle happening every single time you eat. 3, 4, 5, and for some people 6 times a day for some reason, every day of your life. And the Randle cycle will be activated for a good number of hours postprandially every single time, to the point where basically, as it turns out, sure, there are dips and troughs, but you might as well just draw a line through it and say the Randle cycle is always activated in these people. In which case, if you ignore the stuff above the black line that separates the tan-coloured section there with the green-coloured section, the mitochondrial portion specifically. If fat is blocking sugar from entry to the mitochondria at CPT1, and if sugar is blocking that CPT1, and if a buildup of acetyl coenzyme A is allosterically inhibiting pyruvate dehydrogenase, and that's stopping sugar from entering from the cytosol as well, then we have a situation where the mitochondria can't get enough energy, even though there is too much energy already in the cell cytosol. That leads to the mitochondria having a reduced ability to produce ATP at the rate it's required to resynthesize ADP plus inorganic phosphate. Therefore, that's why Ryan said inorganic phosphate builds up in the cell when the Randle cycle is activated. And we know that inorganic phosphate, when it binds to pro-inflammatory cytokines, will turn them all on. Hello, chronic systemic inflammation. Hello, type 1 diabetes, if you didn't have it already, is more likely. Definitely hello, type 2 diabetes. Hello, most forms of cancer. Hello, atherosclerosis, heart disease. Hello, cerebrovascular disease. Hello, dementia. Hello, all the big killers. Every single one of those attributable entirely to people not understanding this little cycle, which was identified by Randall in what year was it, Ryan? Remind me.
60.
In the 60s, wasn't it?
63. Yeah.
63. We've known about this since 1963, and still it's not taught, still it's not understood, still it's not being applied. Still we are telling people eat a mixed macronutrient balanced diet and everything will be fine. Despite the fact that Ryan...
Nobody's like debunking this, right? Nobody's like saying this isn't true, right? Like this is, it's not, there's no counter argument to this, right?
No, this is a fact. This is established. Randall has demonstrated this. That's why it's named after him. He said, look, here's what's going on. Yeah. It's just been completely ignored because it's not in line with the bottom right-hand corner of big agriculture. It's not in line with the bottom right-hand corner of big pharma, who make a lot of money on things like insulin. Not as much as they make on other drugs, but that's for another day. We'll leave that one for now. It's a bit of a tender subject at the moment, but there you go. Okay, so that was the first thing that I kind of wanted to just share a few thoughts. Anything to close off on that one before I move on to my one other point?
Just that, you've had a couple times on your YouTube, you've critiqued the Mastering Diabetes guys who do a low-fat, plant-based diet, and they are very happy to talk about this side of the Randle cycle, and they're correct when they say they're insulin sensitive, and the type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance goes away, but they attribute the other side of the Randle cycle to a low carb diet when they really should be mentioning the mixed macronutrient diet. They're ignoring the low carb, what the low carb side of this shows us. Exactly.
Yes. Good point. Well made. They're saying, look, anytime you have fat and meat in your diet, it gives you insulin resistance. Yes, that is true. Absolutely. If you're also eating carbohydrates in a significant amount. If you remove those carbohydrates, problem solved, in exactly the same way as they are solving the problem in their minds by removing all the fats. The difference, of course, being that a fat-heavy, protein-heavy diet is not nutritionally deficient, and a carb-heavy, fat-depleted diet absolutely, demonstrably is. Okay, that also does feather in and lead me to the second point I wanted to make really brilliantly. I couldn't have actually come up with a better segue if we'd actually planned this, Ryan. And we didn't. This is just a chat that we're having at this time. I want to talk a little bit about something very interesting here as well. That largely these vegans that are saying, look, this is a diet that works, this is a diet that alleviates the Randle cycle, this is a diet that's good. Largely it's a carbohydrate moderate diet, which is also particularly rich in fiber. Indigestible fiber. basically. And everyone's banging on about how you should be eating a whole bunch of fiber, etc., etc. Mostly, fiber is indigestible. We don't have the mechanics to break down fiber, to digest fiber. We're not designed to eat fiber, despite what you'll be told by a lot of these people. Look at as Ryan said, look at the evidence for what we actually really have been eating. It's encoded in the collagen of the long bones. It's stable isotope testing of both nitrogen and carbon that says unequivocally, here's the number, here's what humans typically ate. And there wasn't much variation, actually, in humans, either throughout time nor regionally up until the agrarian revolution, basically. And it's 80% plus meat and animal fat that was consumed by humans, and 20% plant material. However, that 20% plant material was very low in sugars and starches and much higher in fiber than the stuff we currently eat. I mean, most fruits and vegetables are a human invention. They weren't naturally available. So let's get to the point here about fiber before I talk all your ears off. Here it is. The only thing that human beings can do with fiber is have it sit in our colons for a period of time, rotting, basically. In other words, being broken down by bacteria. Such bacteria generally will produce short-chain fatty acids, butyrate. Butyrate is 100% saturated fat. It's a short-chain fatty acid. It can be used, immediately oxidized in the enteric cells where that bacteria is producing it. It can be transformed to beta-hydroxybutyrate, a ketone body, for transport to other cells, say the liver, where it can then be transmuted into triacylglycerides. So if anything, it's going to increase your propensity to have fat for storage. But in the meantime, what you've got there is fiber that is fermenting in your guts, producing fats. There is still an amount of sugar in the fiber containing foods, for want of a better term. Hello, Randall cycle. See how that works? So that's another reason why we need to get all this plant material gone out of our diet. People say, oh, but then what will the enteric cells do for butyrate? Well, you know how I said butyrate can be transmuted to beta-hydroxybutyrate, a ketone body? The opposite is also true. That's how most of these metabolic pathways work. Your enteric cells in your colon are perfectly able to import ketones from your blood and break it to butyric acid. Well, actually, it's butyrate, and oxidize that instead. And if that doesn't work, you can get butyrate from, butter. That's where the word butter came from. It contains a lot of butyric acid. So there you go. That's what I wanted to say. I want to thank you, Ryan, for your time and your efforts putting this presentation together. I think you've explained everything there in a really, really good way. As I said to you the first time I saw it, I said, you absolutely must come on the channel and explain this for people. They'll love it. I'm sure they have done.
Thank you.
So thank you for that. Thank you for your knowledge. And prior to that, thank you very much for your service. Even though I'm not an American myself. Yeah.
Thank you for what you do too. I mean, this presentation that I'm giving to my colleagues in a couple of weeks is inspired by a lot of your videos. So I really appreciate what you do.
My absolute pleasure. I'm here to help. Although people will see that I have a range of YouTube channels, actually, and a range of presentation styles that I adopt on those channels. My main channel, my most popular channel, is one where I am overtly, with malice aforethought, being abrasive, abusive, over the top, and I use lots and lots of very, very short words. I curse like a trooper, for want of a better term, on that channel. Why do I do it? Well, because people love it. They find it amusing. They click on it. They subscribe. Why would I stop doing it? People, there's a lot of hate mail. People saying, why do you do that? Why do you behave like that? Well, because it gets clicks, people. That's why I do it. And then, of course, I have another channel, which is also very science-based, in which we conduct ourselves like you and I are doing today, Ryan. It's all science. There's no abusing anybody or using short words or any of that kind of stuff. I also have another channel where I talk about whether or not our planet is a flat thing. Spoiler, it's not. It's round. And that channel is called ItsRoundLike. And that one's also a science channel, but I also conduct myself there in a similar way to I do on my main sort of nutrition-based channel, where it's swearing at the flat earthers quite a bit. So just so you know, that's what's out there for those that haven't seen my stuff before. Enjoy, watch what you want to. Don't watch what you don't want to. Keep letting me know about it, of course. It's great for the algorithms. Of course, if your commentary is stupid, I'll delete it. Of course I will. If you want to say you're wrong because such and such and give me some rationale, that's fine. But yeah, that's me. That's Ryan. It's been a pleasure to introduce Ryan to the community here. I know that a lot of people have seen Ryan around the channel a lot already in the chat. It's quite a vibrant community that's going here in my channel, and that's a great thing. Yes. So once again, we thank you for your time and your efforts. Good to get somebody else's perspective on. Yeah, no, absolute pleasure. We'll have you again for sure. And if people want Ryan to front up to a live question and answer session about aspects of health science, etc., I'm sure we can twist his arm. But you're going to have to comment underneath saying, "Oh God, yes please, get Ryan back, get him back," whatever you have to do. And I'll see if I can twist his arm. Perhaps I'll put on my general's uniform and order him. Then you'll have to.
Awesome. I'll grab a uniform too.
Awesome. All right. It's been a pleasure. And we'll see you all again next time when probably someone will be wrong on the interwebs and it'll probably be a vegan. All right. See you then. Ciao for now.